Well, good afternoon from Budapest. My name is András Szántó, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this conversation. I'd like to thank our host, TCOM, and the Ludwig Museum in Budapest, and the ZKM Center for Arts and Media. And I'm delighted to be sitting next to my friend, Albert-László Barabási, who joins me here on stage in Budapest, and Professor Peter Weibel, CEO of ZKM, who's joining us on the screen from Karlsruhe. This is a very special day. It marks the launch of an exhibition titled Hidden Patterns, about the extraordinary data visualizations of László's lab, the BarabásiLab, based in Boston, more about which we'll speak in a minute. Today, October 8th, marks the opening of the show at the Ludwig Museum. We can't wait to go over there and see it. It will be up at the Ludwig Museum through mid-January here in Budapest, and then it will travel to Karlsruhe to ZKM, where you can see it if you can make your way there from very last day of February to mid next year, to July. I should mention that in addition to the museum show opening, today is also the publication date of a beautiful book that accompanies the exhibition. We have a picture of it here. It's being published by Hatje Cantz, the wonderful German publishing lab, and this is already giving you your first taste of one of László's data visualizations. The book contains a number of longer and shorter essays from various artists and essays by experts. So that will provide you with a lot of additional context and backgrounds. We have a couple of images from the book, which I'd like to show you if we can, just to give you a first sort of teaser of the extraordinary diversity and range of these data visualizations. We're not going to go into great detail now, but as you can see, this is all made of data in ways that we will understand shortly. Sometimes these visualizations are in 2 dimensions, sometimes they're in 3 dimensions. Lately, they've been in virtual space, and László tells me that soon they will be in 4 dimensions. Don't even ask me what that means, but as a physicist, maybe you can explain later on. So that's the book. Just to give you a little bit of context, László and I are both Hungarians. We both happen to be Hungarians. He grew up in Transylvania. I grew up actually a few blocks from here in Budapest. We both landed more or less at the same time in the United States about 30 years ago in very different academic fields. László is a physicist who found his way to the world of visuality and the arts in Boston. I'm a sociologist who found my way to the arts in New York. Well, it took us a while to meet, but once we did, we started a very deep dialogue about your work and what it means, particularly in the art world. And I have to say, it's been absolutely rewarding and eye-opening. Last year, I went with László to Art Basel, which is the great gathering of the art world. And he really enjoyed being incognito, because usually when he's in the science world, he's a little bit of a rock star. And we've enjoyed exploring that world. But today is really a very special moment, because now it's a kind of coming out party. It's the first exhibition devoted to these visualizations of the BarabásiLab. And we're going to be speaking about that in the next hour or so. But let me say a few words about Professor Peter Weibel. Again, he's joining us from Germany. Those of you who are joining us from the art world, he needs no introduction. He has been a leading voice in the discourse on art, science, technology. He was actually born in Ukraine. And he has a legendary body of artistic work spanning visual poetry, film, video, performance, in what used to be called intermediate arts. And really, since the 1980s, he's been, more than anyone I can think of, really a leading voice in discussions about media arts and digital arts. So his perspective is very important. And of course, he runs the ZKM for the last 20 years in Karlsruhe, which is this extraordinary museum research center on visual culture. And it's a kind of magic place where these types of experiments are going on. It was launched in 1989 with a mission to reimagine the classical arts in the digital age. So it was also a logical place for this exhibition to go to. So we'll chat for a little bit, and please go ahead and ask questions online. We'll try to get to those. But first, I'd just like us to get a little bit of context. So Laszlo, could you briefly sort of give us a sense of your journey? Tell us what got you to this place, this sort of intersection of science and art.
Well, first of all, thank you, András and Peter Weibel for being here. And I'm truly honored to really, for this moment, for this exhibition opening. And indeed, it may seem strange that a physicist is being shown, or a physicist's lab, to be more precise, and we need to talk about that, is being shown in a museum. And this is a long journey that in many ways, as we show in the exhibit, started 25 years ago. Even though I'm trained as a physicist, my field is network science, which will explore really large complex networks. But my methodology of exploring them has been always very deeply visual. Mm-hmm. And even though I am known as a scientist, which means that I produce scientific papers full of formulas and algorithms and so on, I'm occasionally also known as an author, where I translate some of the work from my lab, coming out from my lab, for a general audience. What people perhaps never had a chance to see until now, that I always had the third medium, which is kind of the visual representation of what we do. Mm-hmm. And this is not only a passion, but it's also a necessity. I'm a visual thinker, so I have to see what I'm working on. Mm-hmm. And whether it means that I draw it a little bit by hand, or whether it means that we find algorithms and build algorithms to bring them out, seeing it is part of understanding it. So for the last 25 years, really, from the very beginning that I became interested in networks, our research was also followed or trailed by the process of visualizations.
And I remember first visiting Laszlo has this extraordinary lab, which we'll talk more about. It's in a beautiful building in Boston, a whole floor. And it's really one of those movie sets, you know, when you go into science fiction movie and there's always somebody writing on a glass wall, doing all sorts of formulas. And there's lots, it's a very visual place. And it's not entirely a coincidence, because I think there's quite a lot of art in your past and in your family's past.
It is. So my father was a museum director, and before becoming a museum director, he ran a school for mostly like adults. And that was the first time that I experienced art, well, I'd say in a more conscious way, because I stumbled across the studio and I started to do sculpture. And that kind of started a passion that stayed with me for several years, going as far as dreaming and studying to become a sculptor. Mm-hmm. What happened at the same time, however, is that physics was happening with me as well, or I kind of also encountered roughly about the same year physics as well. And I started to win all of these physics competitions. Mm-hmm. And honestly, I've been struggling in art. You know, it was a very difficult thing for me to do, even though I terribly enjoyed it. So eventually I ended up kind of moving towards physics, but this passion never died out. And when for the first time I had the opportunity to really take up an art curriculum was once I became a professor at the University of Notre Dame. Mm-hmm. And the university offered me the chance to take every semester a course freely. And I chose effectively to take their art curriculum. So for several years, I would kind of go back to my passion and retrain myself. So in a way, you know, why I was doing networks and I was doing physics, all my free time was spent at going to art museums and so on. So what happened along the way is that that passion has informed the way we visualize network. Yeah. There's a long history of artists appropriating works from the world, and particularly from science. This is what I would consider an inverse appropriation.
And I would say probably a better strategy. I would say become a world famous artist first, and then engage the world of art, then vice versa. But we'll see which of the strategies works better. Peter Weibel, you know, you could say that Laszlo had impeccable timing. He found his way to the intersection of art and science just when these extraordinary tools became available. You know, a lot of what we see here is based on incredible computing power, incredible visualization capabilities. Peter, could you situate what you see here and what our viewers have just briefly seen from the perspective of the art world and its narrative? Where does this sort of show up in the world that you belong to?
What Barabási and his lab are doing was called in former times, it is based on computers, it was called computer art. But the more contemporary term would be what Barabási and his lab is doing, I would call it digital art. But what makes a difference of digital art to classical art? Classical art was a technique of representation, and the representation was directed to objects. In the next step, when in the beginning of the century, the relation between painting and object was cut, you had so-called abstract art. It's not a correct term, because what happened in the abstract art was you have means of representation. You have point, line, and plane. So the book by Kandinsky is called From Point to Line to Plane. And normally, when you go back to the work of Leonardo da Vinci, he said in his famous book about painting, he said, painting is a science, pittura scientia. And he said, the means of the painters are point, line, and plane to represent the visible objects of the world. We have to remember this, the visible objects of the world. But now we have patterns of things we don't see. This is now the interesting thing. Painters have been prisoners of the national perception. They represent what you see with your national eyes. And then they said, okay, we cut this, and we can say, we use now points, lines, and planes, and show only the means of representation. We show points as points, we show lines as lines. This is what people call abstract art. It's still prisoners of objectual-oriented representation. And now, with Barabási and his lab, we see they are not directed to represent objects, they represent data. Now the question is, what are the structures of the patterns behind data? So this is a new question, because before you will want to find out what are the relations and structures between dots, points, and planes. You could make rules of symmetry. And it was actually in Hungary, we have great researchers of symmetric aesthetics. So what is now for me interesting, the first point. How can we represent data? Or how can we visualize data? This is a new step in the art of representation. So it's not anymore the objectual world, not the objects. No, it is now the data. And data can be anything, can be numbers, can be sounds, can be words, can be objects. Everything is turned into data. We are living in a world completely of data, in a world of data administration. But we have no aesthetics. We have a world of data administration, from train to whatever, information administration. Now we have found a way how we can aesthetically, not only aesthetically visualize a visual pleasure. We have found a way to discover patterns which are hidden. Now comes the point. Normally, these patterns are defined geometrically, as art of space. Now we see his patterns are in motion. Now patterns are becoming the art of time. So it's very close to music and to the moving images. So he has moved the idea of patterns into the rhythms of time and music. And this is kind of new pattern art, this kind of hidden patterns we can realize, new structures which have not been visible before. And structures, in the next step, you can also use this pattern to produce music. I can predict that Barabási and his team in future, or his followers, will use his patterns to produce a kind of music which he did not hear before. But at the moment, we can see patterns, hidden structures, beyond symmetry. So everything what classical art has evolved, symmetric composition, etc., or contour composition, now we realize we had fractal geometry. Now we have found a new way to visualize, that means to discover new hidden patterns. What is also important, and this is a question I have to Barabási myself, in mathematics, we have two schools. Geometry, which is something, the art of what you see, and you have analysis. But you have what we call analytic geometry, when geometric objects have been turned into numbers. In around 1800s, there was a wonderful, great mathematician, physician called Lagrange. And when he wrote his book around 1800 about the mechanics of the world, he said in the preface, this is the first scientific book because it does not use drawings, it doesn't use diagrams. It's only algebraic operations. So for 200 years, we had the claim science is only when you have algebraic operations. Then, in the 20th century, came David Hilbert with his book about geometry. And he said, okay, when I speak about cubes, about geometric objects, I can replace them at any time with real objects like table, chairs, etc. So we have two schools. So one school says we can only operate to explain the world with numbers. The other school says in geometry, we can visualize everything. What is geometry? We can turn numbers into pictures. Now we have Barabási who says us we can turn data into pictures. So what, Albert-László, is your position between these two schools?
Perfect.
Well, that's a very interesting question. And I have never really thought in those terms because one of the essence of network science and network thinking, that the value is not in the object, but in the relationship between them. It's in the linkages, it's in the connections. And this is really this connectivity that we're trying to really explore. And one way to think about it is that life is not about the molecule. It's about the relationship between the molecules, the reactions in which they engage, the binding interactions and so on. So maybe there is actually a third category of, what we do. I often think of a little bit kind of using your analogies is that it's a data realism. Because whatever we do, it has to have fidelity to the data. We cannot deviate from that, right? But then we need to bring it out in a way to tell a story, to bring out these hidden connections in the data that, as you said, would not be visible. And in that way, it's merging geometry because fundamentally, the way you represent networks, the data sculptures are geometric objects, right? We are turning them into physical objects that are geometric. So we're using data and being informed by data to create geometrical objects that have kind of the fidelity to the original message of the data. And this is this very interesting space where we have to actually kind of operate and find meaning in these visualizations.
And this is the moment where some of our viewers are starting to think maybe they should have taken that extra geometry class in high school. I think for the benefit of those of us who don't have physics PhDs, maybe this would be a good moment to give a very brief explanation for what is going on here. So in other words, could you just explain some of the building blocks of network science? Sure. And then could you describe how these are translated to this exhibition and the kind of examples that we can see here?
Absolutely. So as I said earlier, I'm defining myself as a network scientist, and that's a new term. And I may have been one of the first network science professors out there. There are many now. And the question is, why do we have network science? And the reason we have network science is because fundamentally, our biological existence, our social construction is all based on networks. You know, our cell really operates as a network. The molecules interact and react with each other. The society works as a network. We're in relationship with each other, whether it's personal, familiar, or professional. The economy works at networks. We're selling and buying between sellers and buyers and so on. So fundamentally, most complex systems around us organize themselves as networks. Mm-hmm. But it has been only recently possible, say about 20 years ago when we started thinking about that, to really map these networks out. And I would say in many, many ways, much of the science before that has focused on the components, on the molecules, on the atoms, on the individual. Mm-hmm. And about 20 years ago, with the arrival of the digitization of everything, for the first time, we have been given the opportunity to map these networks out. Mm-hmm. And then we were in for a surprise. Mm-hmm. And the surprise was that it's easy to argue that the molecular network has nothing to do with the society or nothing to do with the economy. But the big discovery of network science is that there's a deep universality. And at the network level, these very different systems are very much alike. Mm-hmm. So therefore, if you are a networks, or if you're interested in biological networks, or if you're interested in social networks, or interested as an art as a network, you are actually going to encounter the same tools, the same perspectives, the same models, and hence network science offers a way for different disciplines to converse to each other.
So what are those disciplines? So in this show, this is the first exhibition where we really, how many years are we talking about now?
It depends on, so the first visual work of the exhibit of a network was born in 1995, January 1995. So we're talking about 25 years.
Which is, you know, from the perspective of the history of science, a blip. But it just happened to be at a great time because you got all these new tools coming your way. So you've been able to actually touch a number of different areas. I should probably mention that you also hold an appointment at the Harvard School of Medicine. So the show is a bit of a overview of the different spheres you have examined with your lab.
Correct.
Can you just briefly mention which those are?
Sure. So the first work of the show is really an abstract network, which is the first network that I built in '95. But then as we go around the room, we're actually going to have rooms where we counter the specific stops that the lab has gone through. We started first studying the internet and the World Wide Web, but our lab has actually been very much focused on human mobility and contact networks, which of course are very networks of the moment because that's the network on which COVID is spreading. So we have rooms devoted to data. For many years, I was very interested in how you control a network, and some really fabulous visualizations by Mauro Martino, who was the first designer and artist in my lab of residence, is devoted to data. In the last 10, 15 years, my work, particularly at the Harvard Medical School, has focused on network medicine. That is, what are the subcellular networks that kind of, represent life really at the molecular level, and how the breakdown of that network leads to human diseases. So we have 2 rooms devoted to that subject. And then, of course, about 5 years ago, we became very interested in the art world as a network. So we have about 2 rooms devoted to some of the studies of how do we represent and how do we kind of penetrate and try to understand the art world by collecting all the data about artists' movement between institutions and mapping it out and visualizing it. So there's a wide breadth of topics, but there is something common between them, which is always the networks offer a particular penetrating view and helps us understand these systems.
And the other thing that's common is that you're not presenting mathematical equations, you're presenting visual representations of these networks, which are mathematics brought to life.
Correct. And actually what is interesting about this is that for 25 years, these really never had a home. A few of the images in the show have appeared as illustrations in some of our work in the research paper. A few of them have ended up on the cover of the journals where we published our papers, but I would say that 90% of the work that will be shown here have not actually been shown before because they did not have a room in the scientific narrative. They didn't belong to the scientific papers. They didn't belong to the science books.
So it's a kind of happy byproduct.
They are a happy byproduct that was essential for the research method. So it was essential for us to understand these systems. And it's really wonderful that now they're finding a home in the museum environment.
So Peter Weibel, when you look at these things, I mean, you've had a chance, I think, to see quite a few of them. Do you see science? Do you see art? Do you see data? Do you see echoes of other artists? I mean, how do these things register for you?
Mr. Barabási said a very interesting sentence. He said, I'm interested in the relation between things. Remember? Yeah? And this is precisely a sentence which repeats a sentence by Georges Braque. Braque was the inventor of Cubism with Picasso. And he said precisely, I don't paint things, I paint the relation between things. Yeah? So we see he's had a clear tradition of Cubism. But in Cubism was one problem. There was a non-moving object, and the spectator was moving around the object. So there was something standing on the table, a guitar, and then the spectator, the painter, moved around and showed from multiple perspectives one object. Now we are much more far away. So what he's doing, he calls it network thinking. That means this network thinking is the next step after system thinking. No? So I will ask Barabási, what is the difference between system thinking and network thinking? But before his answer, I would say, you see, he's very clear into problems posed by artists. So it is post-cubism, it is post-futurism, etc., etc. No? Because now comes the next thing, what is interesting. In our culture, we have up to now only a two-dimensional notation. We have a paper, a painting, or we write a letter on a paper. We write notes, musical sounds and notes on paper. So everything what we do is a notation on 2 dimensions. And now with the computer, this is important, it is the first time we can simulate 3-dimensional notation. This is a very important step in the future of not only of art and science, of mankind. No? Because as you see, when these data are moving in space and time, so you see, this is not something you could draw. This is not something you could paint because it is 3-dimensional notation, but they show only as a simulation. No? And this step from 2-dimension to 3-dimension, this is, I think, part of network thinking. Therefore, my question, what is the difference for you between system thinking and network thinking?
So this is very interesting because when I started working in network science and I became interested, obviously I started to look at systems thinking and systems theory and von Bertalanffy and some of the Hungarians even who had great contributions.
Bertalanffy is also a Hungarian name, no?
He's a Hungarian name, correct.
Exactly.
And
every Hungarian will tell you that everything is about Hungarians. So,
well, in network science, that happens to be true, but that's a different chapter. And what is interesting is that it's very inspiring what systems thinking the people in that community have done. But our generation, it feels like there were people who are trying to understand the world without having the tools to do so. Mm-hmm. And what I mean having the tools to do so, what they were lacking is really the data. So lacking the data, hence they ended up building castles of ideas and thoughts that it's very difficult to map in the current reality. But this is also part of, I think, of a process that we're seeing now in the world, that things are going much more from the theory towards the algorithm, let's put it this way, right? So, which is kind of more and more being able to actually see and experience the things that before we could only think about and we can only imagine.
Yes, well, I think as someone who came out of sociology, when I was in graduate school 30 years ago, there was network theory, and there was a whole body of literature around it, and there were sociologists, including network theorists, who were looking at the art world. But we couldn't dream of having these tools. I mean, back then we had punch cards and absolutely no, the screens were in black and white. So I think I really, one of the things that makes me excited about this work is that it literally would not have been possible 10, 15 years ago. And that also means that there are things that are not yet possible, but are right around the corner, which we'll get back to later. But I have a feeling that our viewers are starting to be really curious what these things look like. So what I'd like to do now is zero in on a few things in the exhibition so that we can get a taste of what's in there. And I'd like to start with Nature magazine. And this is the cover of the 150th anniversary of the very prestigious Nature magazine, which commissioned your lab on its 150th anniversary to render something related to what they have produced in this time. And we're going to start a little video which you can explain what came out of this project.
Yes, indeed. So this was actually a very unexpected request from the editorial team of Nature that we should be designing the cover of Nature for the anniversary issue. And to do so, what my team have done actually is to go ahead and map out all the papers that the Nature has published over a 150-year period, precisely more like from 1900 on, because that's where the data is, and build a network where each node corresponds to a research paper, the color corresponds to the specific domain, whether biology or physics they belong to, and the links correspond to the relationship in the eye of the beholder, that is whether the community considers those papers to be related because they cite them together. And from that, we got this really massive and very beautiful network that on one end shows the collision of disciplines, how the different colors come together, each color corresponding to different disciplines, and also allows us to tell the story of nature, of how some seminal discoveries that were published by the journal have actually triggered other discoveries and new disciplines and so on. So these are the type of links that it's not possible to see between two nodes. You have to really work with massive amount of data, because to infer one relationship, one link between two papers, you need to find hundreds of other papers who cite them together. And I think the output was totally amazing, even for me, of what we actually found in the data. And eventually the one-page invitation to have a one-page cover turned into a 5-page fold-out cover, as well as this video rendered by Mauro Martino, who used to be in my lab, and now he leads the IBM visualization lab. And kind of created the new narrative of how we, in my view, created a new narrative of how we actually think about this massive amount of network data and what is possible to visualize it.
And is it just the joy of seeing this universe, or is there something, for example, that the editors of Nature would have learned that they have done that they perhaps wouldn't have understood before?
So it's a good question whether you want to use these data as a tool for intervention, right? Mm-hmm. And in this case, it was totally a celebration of the moment as well as a diagnosis, right? Mm-hmm. Is to kind of go back. And what you have to realize is that the Nature team is a very young team, very energetic team. And we're looking at a 150-year perspective that even them as editors don't have. Mm-hmm. So together we learned so much about the journal's history and their highlights and their big moments and how they kind of built on each other, that I don't think that even the most veteran editor has actually that view, because right. That would kind of correspond to 30 years and not 150 years.
Yes, I mean, to me, it's a little bit like when you see your family tree for the first time and you sort of realize where you come from. And I'm sure as Peter was looking at this, you were thinking what kind of music would go with this particular work. Let's keep going, unless, Peter, do you have anything to say about this one?
I would say, we know the famous phrase by Paul Klee, art should make the invisible make visible. Huh? But he was thinking about his own emotions and own effects to make the interior of the artist to make visible. Now we have a different step, because the world of data is for most people completely invisible and hidden. They don't even understand the world of data. And now we see in a very rigorous way that he makes us visible, his invisible data world. Therefore, it doesn't only create pattern, he calls it correctly hidden patterns. No? That means the patterns which have been not visible are now suddenly not hidden, they are visible now. So in fact, it is a program of art to make invisible things visible. And this is now scientific, because I would say classical art ended, the national perception ended. Science starts, the national perception has ended. We can say science with microscope, with telescopes starts, the national perception ends. Now we see both together. He's a scientist who makes the data with computers visible. It's digital art. At the same time, he continues an artistic program. What I have said from Braque to Klee, and also the famous Hungarian tradition of constructivism, of opera, etc. We see all these tendencies in art culminating, but moving from objects to data. And now comes the point, what we see here is not only beautiful, it's a kind of bio-design. It's imitating, as a result, it looks like a living organism, what I call biomedia. Media today have aspects of imitating the behavior and the of life. What you see here now, this work has even an epistemic value. It helps us to understand the world. It's not only beautiful, it has an epistemic value of knowledge.
Well, I think it's good of you to mention this Klee quote about making the invisible visible. Certainly one of our expectations of art is that it should embody some kind of meaning in a way, in a certain language. And ideally, it should also lead us to act or think a certain way. And in many of those respects, what we see here satisfies the criterion of an artwork. And later on, when we talk about the art world network, we'll talk about, is it art? But I want to thank Peter for using the word beauty, which a lot of art theorists don't like to talk too much about beauty. But beauty is certainly a word that comes to mind when you look at this thing. And it is very clear that you and your colleagues had made certain decisions that are aesthetic decisions that have nothing to do with science. Probably our colleagues here from TCOM are very happy that you're using this purple color, which seems to be the color of this company. But you made some choices. How do you make those choices, which are really science? The data is not telling you which colors to use.
Absolutely. And you're raising kind of like a very complex issue about really, what is the role of aesthetics in visualization, in data visualization. And for me, actually, that kind of what I first understood that was around 2000. And we have a very kind of highly reproduced protein network map that we did back then. And I remember clearly that at that time I articulated to my team that this has to be a figure that works well within the scientific paper for which we produced it, but it also has to have a meaning once you take it out and it's shown of its own. So the criteria for some of these images is that they have to stand on their own without, even if you don't understand what was the idea behind that, what was the concept behind, what's the data behind that. And I consider the data and the meaning a bonus, an added context, that if you understand that as well, I think it becomes, at least for me, far more exciting. And to some degree, actually, this follows the narrative of the contemporary art, right? Is when we see a shoe on the table in the museum, it's a shoe on the table unless you really understand the context and what are the ideas and what really turns that one into being more than a shoe on the table. But on the other hand, the data has its own aesthetics. And I think people who are going to go through the museum exhibit will kind of experience that these works, after you see enough, become recognizable. And they're not recognizable because we make them so, but because there is some organic nature of the way things are connected in the world that eventually comes out in these visualizations. And we use often the term organic, right? Is that we have to kind of bring that the real intent of the data out. And when you do, because of this deep universality across many different network-based systems, we actually start seeing recurring elements.
I'm reminded, of course, of the story of photography, which people didn't think of in an aesthetic way, merely as a tool to render reality. And over time, it sort of freed itself up to be more and more aesthetical. Let's go to the next sample. Because this goes to your work in the area of health science. This is the web of illnesses. It's one of the more beautiful things, I think, if not that we're using the word beauty in the exhibition. Tell us a little bit about what's going on here.
So the last 15 years, we have spent lots of time to try to understand how the molecules, precisely the proteins in the cell, bind to each other and connect to each other. And each of us have about 20,000 genes, and they translate in about 20,000 proteins, which kind of each gene creates one. And these are the little machineries that kind of really kind of do all the work in the cell. And they do so by binding together, interacting with each other. And this network is trying to capture that, but it has actually been quite a bit of challenge to do so because it's a very, very, very dense network. And somehow it seems like the two sequences we have, this was Mauro, who was again in my lab, and he kind of invented this methodology by simply flashing the links as they come into view and avoiding the need to show everything. Now, there is a history of that many of my colleagues scientists have tried to represent this network before, and it's often called a hairball or a reticulogram because it becomes so dense that that's impossible to see anything. And I think here the visualization advance was to kind of penetrate that denseness by showing only the links that are there. But this is your cell inside, right? And actually the breakdown of some of these interactions is what we call disease. And the drugs that we actually get to cure the disease are binding to one of these proteins. And they tried to cure so by bringing the interactions back or blocking interactions that should not be there. So really, there's a new field of science that I have helped co-start, and now there's a whole department, there's the whole division of network medicine at Harvard Medical School that is focusing on these networks to develop the next set of drugs.
And to unpack these moving networks even more is why we will need the fourth dimension.
I think the fourth dimensions will be much more interesting if we talk in context of the data sculptures. Okay. That's where they're going to come in.
All right, well, we'll come back to that. Quick question, Peter, very quick question. Who does that make you think of?
This, I was thinking of the chambers where you see particles, no? The famous atomic chambers where you see the floating of particles, no? You have been asking me what I think of artistic model, or what was the question?
Exactly. Artistic.
It is action painting, no?
Wonderful. Okay, I think we got the headline from today. We finally got from Laszlo to Pollock in 35 minutes. Well done. Next stop is going to be something that is very timely. This is bringing your various interests together, and something that for me personally is very meaningful. This is a map of New York City, the city where I live, during COVID. And it just so happens that these visualizations look like breathing lungs, although that's a mistake to interpret it that way. So tell us what's going on here. This is very recent, as we can see from earlier this year.
It is not at all a mistake, actually. So in the last 10 years, I have spent a bit of time kind of studying asthma and COPD. So it was certainly inspired by that. But what do we see here? Well, obviously during the COVID, we were always thinking of like how we can actually represent that. And my lab has kind of worked quite a bit on human mobility, of how people move around that. And one room is devoted in the exhibit to that problem. So we got access to the mobile phone data from New York City. And we ended up using a tool set. My postdoc, Michael Denzinger, who is a scientist, ended up a tool set that continuously deforms the size of the city depending on how many people are active in that moment.
So when the lung blows up, that means a lot of people are in the city. And
particularly early afternoon, or when everybody, and when it goes down is the kind of the end of the day, and then comes the weekend, the two smaller kind of oscillations. But of course, what is interesting is in this one is not only the fact that kind of really New York City fills in with life, and that metamorphosis that the city has during the day, where we chose actually to kind of go with the rhythm of the breathing, but also what happens around March 20, as we're kind of coming closer and closer to that moment, when really obviously nobody has to be explained that this is kind of when the comet shutdown comes out. And really people flee New York City, like yourself did.
Yes, I mean, at this day, very day that we see now is when we move to our weekend house. Yeah.
That's right. And so what you see actually following that moment, when pretty much the New York City collapses, like the lung collapses in case of somebody who has really a serious lung disease like COPD, that then you see that kind of returns alive. This was the moment of collapse. This was kind of the worst case, when everybody simply hunkered down and pretty much stopped using their phone, turned the computer, and so on. And then what you see is what is still there today is an injured lung that is like the New York City continues to be alive, but it does so at a 50% capacity. It's not breathing truly, and it returned to a new stable pattern, which is the new world that we are experiencing.
Although I should say, in defense of my borough of Brooklyn, that I don't think you would see quite the same thing. I think this is a real Manhattan story.
Could very well be. But I would actually say that if you want to kind of think beyond the image, this is kind of representing the new way of life that we've been forced into. I mean, there's no question to anybody that the 21st century started with COVID for us, right? This is probably the first defining moment in the history of the 21st century. And there is no looking back. And we're going to have a long period that is defined by this moment. And in a way, we kind of built this particular visualization where which is a collaboration between a scientist and my designer Alice Grishenko, who's been for several years in the lab, to really represent that the new normal. Yeah. And the new normal is this injured or a different working lung.
Peter, I just again quickly want to ask you, are you seeing a lot of artists? I know ZKM has a huge network of its own of artists and practitioners. Are you starting to see work coming out of this COVID period, other types of representations of this moment in other media? And
we have many artists since several years who are interested in visualization of data, huh? But none of these artists has a scientific model like Barabási. No? When they visualize data, they are following synesthetic programs like what is the relation between color and sound, or they are following syncretic problems, how can you generate with the same code music, or can you generate with the same code visuals? Here we have a new step. What you described, the virus, is a new, very difficult to understand system of distribution. And people make a lot of mistakes. People say, for example, in Germany, I don't know in other countries, the virus knows no border. And so they say, yes, the virus knows a border, 1 or 2 meters. We don't know borders because we're moving all the time, and we spread the virus. And we have a kind of mass mobility. And we don't understand this excessive mass mobility, which is one of the reasons of this distribution of the virus. So we need to learn what we have seen with Barabási, mathematical models to understand. This is precisely the point. We need mathematical models to understand the distribution of the virus. If you don't have, therefore, the title of the work of Barabási, the language of network thinking, is very important. We have many languages. We have body language, we have language of the media, we have the alphabetic language, but now we have to learn the language of data, because we're living, our world is a field of data, and the virus is part of data. What we see in my model, the virus is just as a famous writer, Wilhelm Burroughs has said, language is a virus from outer space. You remember, András, remember, it's a famous sentence, no? So it's very clear. We have communication is about virus. Communication is contagious. And now it is very correct what Barabási says. This is the first decisive moment, 21st century. No? And therefore we need data models, what he's delivering, to understand not only the distribution of virus, to understand and any other way of distribution of information, distribution of commodities, of people, etc., etc. No? So we are really in the step, it's a step of a new language. And what we can say, maybe my last word, this is a famous Hungarian Nobel Prize winner, Eugene Wigner, a physicist. And he made a very famous article called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in Physics. Now we learn by Barabási in his lab the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in aesthetics.
That could be the next exhibition. And now we come to perhaps my favorite, but certainly the one that we've talked about the most, which is your network. And before we, about the art world, but before we go there, if there's anybody who wants to ask a question who's online, please send it now, because if there are any, then we'll ask them. If not, as you can see, we all have plenty to say. So really what kind of really got us going in our conversations was Laszlo's attempt to map the art world, something I could only have dreamt of 30 years ago when I was beginning my work as a sociologist of this space. And what you see here is, I believe, probably just part of it, is a rendering of the art world. And well, I'll just let you describe what we're actually looking at.
Sure. I mean, you know, by the time this work came along, I was very engaged with the artwork as a collector, as someone who organized exhibitions. So I became more and more familiar with the institutions of the art system. And so it then came the opportunity, thanks to Magnus Resch, who is a New York-based art entrepreneur and a postdoc of mine, or in the institute, Sam Fremberger, who kind of came to the lab and they said, would you be interested in start looking at the data that they collected that contained, for the last 40 years, every single exhibit of every single artist all over the world?
So
we're talking
40 years.
40 years, we're talking about almost 500,000 artists exhibited in about 20,000 venues.
How many exhibitions?
Geez, I never actually counted. We have that for you, not on top of my head. Yeah, and so we ended up using this data first to kind of rebuild the career of every single artist. What you would actually have the CV on the artist CV where he or she was exhibited. But we did so because we were curious about capturing really the relationship between the institutions. And why is so? Because in many ways, whether this glass of water is really a glass of water or art, it depends very much on the context, right? It depends on who put it where. If this happens to be in the museum and the pedestal and an artist placed it there, and depending on who is the artist, where that artist has been exhibited and so on, this could actually have a narrative that would make it a valuable work of art. Here it happens to be a glass of water. So the question was, well, how is value created in the system of art? And so we realized that the institutions are playing a very, very important role. And how artists travel between the institutions is really captured in this data. So the network that you saw over there, nodes corresponds to institutions, and they're connected. If we find what we call mathematical statistical significant relationship, meaning that if one institution exhibits an artist, the other one is likely to take the same artist, that they co-exhibit the same artist. Why is that important? Because you don't actually kind of put a work of art on the table and MoMA immediately exhibits. Before you get to MoMA or ZKM, you would have to actually be exhibited at other institutions, because the artwork is really deeply connected and they watch each other and there are isms and there are kind of taste of what is important and what is not. So this data is really capturing these hidden connections between the institutions that often not even the practitioners are deeply aware of. Not that they don't know the other institutions, but they don't understand to what degree it shapes their opinion and which institution really shapes their opinion. Mm-hmm. And this is very important, not just because we are able to get a map of the institutions, but this network turns out to be defining for the artistic career, because we were able to show that depending on where an artist starts his or her career on these networks, allows us to predict his or her future success.
Which it turns out is not a pretty picture if you're not coming from the center of the network.
Correct. If you start high, you stay high, pretty much. That's kind of, but for me, actually, it's much more interesting to think about the artists who don't start high, those who actually start in Eastern Europe, or they start at very small institutions and galleries all over the world. And so we actually had a special focus on them. We ended up finding about 275 artists who really started at the periphery of the artwork at not very prestigious institutions, at very isolated geographical places, and they made it into the A-League. Yeah. And there are patterns that we find that these artists have done differently from other artists that allowed them to get there.
Yeah. Usually they took a plane and moved somewhere else.
Not necessarily,
but I want to make sure we have time. I want to talk about your lab, but I can't resist asking a couple of quick questions about the art world, because we are, after all, doing this in a museum. First of all, you mentioned earlier that the big surprise was that networks behave similarly. So is the art world any different from another network?
Well, I think it would be very disappointing if I tell the real answer, which is not, right? So when you actually, boil it down to links and notes and you forget the content, the art world follows precisely the same mathematical patterns that we see in the World Wide Web, or we see in the node, or in the kind of on the cell. But context matters, right? Because once you put those metadata back of what the nodes and the links are, it asks you to ask questions that you don't ask in other systems. And this is one of the reasons I like to engage in different areas, because they bring us questions that are not relevant in other cases. Right. For example, in the World Wide Web is not a relevant question of how you really travel on this network and how you get to the hubs, because the hubs are easily available and so on. But in the artist network, that's really the question from the artist perspective. So different systems bring different questions that require their own set of tools to develop to understand them.
You recently wrote a book about success and careers, and there was a chapter there on art. Is there something you could quickly say? What are the sort of 3 great moves that somebody should make if they want to be a successful artist?
Well, you know, so now pay attention, right?
Yes.
So
Write
we're
this
gonna
down.
spill the beans, right? I think I should go back to these 275 artists who really kind of started from the bottom and they make up to the top, because that's the real story, right? To me. And what was different about them is the relentless search at the early stage of their career. Many artists, even when they're young artists, they end up signing up with the gallery and kind of staying in the attraction area of that institution, who kind of creates them opportunities and so on. What we find is that these 275 artists who really kind of made the jump over a 10-year period, they didn't do that pattern. They really seek out very different type of institutions as their kind of partners and exhibited there. And through that, they accidentally hit on 1 or 2 notes that had the right connections to the center of the world.
Mm-hmm.
So often the artist's dream is to be signed up by a gallery, but it may also be a factor that would pull them back and not push them forward, depending on the gallery and where it is and what opportunities that creates to them.
Peter, if you were a young artist, would you take this advice?
Not really, huh? Not really, because his book, The Formula of Success, naturally is for many people interesting, because everybody, or most people, want to have a successful career. But in this area, naturally the word network has a different opinion. We speak, for example, in the art world from old Bohr's network. So it's a field of art. The meaning of network is more about power. And naturally, I don't know how Barabási can model mathematically the network of power. So I have to ask him, because in naturally, when you have, I give you a joke to understand the power. 2 oligarchs visit the collection. And then one oligarch says to another one, aha, Van Gogh, very good. Aha, Munch, excellent. Aha, Monet, first class. Aha, Picasso, wonderful. Aha, Gagosian. This is perfect. Gagosian is the name of this most powerful gallery in the world. So you see, in art, it's not only about statistics and classical mathematical networks, it's also the network of power. Therefore, I have no advice for young artists, really. It's the only thing what I can say to young artists, I say always, any idea you have, do it, because if you don't do it, another one do it anyway and will have success. So don't be too selective about your ideas, because many people think my idea is not good enough. Say, do it, because if you don't do it, another one do it anyway.
So we have limited time, and I want to quickly, now that people have seen what the output is, can you just briefly say a few words? I mean, this is not one person's work. This is a team's work. Just very quickly tell us how this works.
Yes, so I'm really glad that you bring this up, because it's very important to understand that this is not my artwork, right? This is really a collective work in the true sense of the word, right? Because there are many people...
It's a Renaissance model, no? It's a Renaissance model, what you're doing, like in the Renaissance, no?
Studio.
But it's not a studio either, because we actually organize with the value system of science. And the value system of science actually kind of includes of acknowledging everybody who contributed and their role in the project. So, and if you see both in the catalog as well as the exhibit, we have everybody listed who contributed, from the designer to the student to the postdoc who did that. But the model is relatively interesting and simple. We perform research in the lab, and part of the research, we always insist of developing the visual language of the problem as well. And really, this is what happened over the last 25 years, is that we have, by accident, by necessity, by design, we ended up developing a visual language of networks. And so every member of the lab is kind of engaged in that process. But we also hire designers who work with us for several years, who are helping the lab members. And their role is not to make things beautiful, but to be embedded in the team and help us understand the data. So typically, let's take the Nature 150 project. After I've been asked by Nature to kind of design the cover, it was not me who designed the cover, right? The first step was a team of 3 scientists ended up collecting all the data and analyzing that. And that was actually a project led by Alexander Gates, who's a postdoc in my lab, and two other, Quinke and Onul Varol have helped. So 3 people did that. And once the data was together, then we started brainstorming of what is the data telling us? What is that really good for? What is the right representation? And that moment we started to involve Alice Grishenko, the designer, and she, and together with the team on pretty much mailing on a daily basis, we put them in the same office. Then they ended up kind of developing this visual language. And then when we had that static rendering of the network, then Mauro Martino came in, who then ended up doing the videos because he has an exceptional talent of actually on 3-dimensional visualizations and rendering. So we ended up having a layer of expertise that all came around that project. And this is not atypical. This is how the lab works.
And of course, I'm reminded of those extraordinary books about the great textile Gobelin workshops from 300 years ago, going back to the Low Countries, where huge teams were working together to realize these tapestries, or of course the film industry today. So obviously this kind of very advanced visualization has to be the product of that kind of process. We have very little time. I want to acknowledge a few questions. One is whether you were inspired or feel any affinity to George Kepes, who was the founder of the Center for Advanced Visual Studies at MIT, just down the street from where you work.
Absolutely. I mean, not only him, but also Moholy Nagy, who has been a great experimenter. And I think in both of the cases, I was totally impressed by their freedom of expression, that they didn't really, they weren't afraid to try new forms. And I was, I think George Kepes is still waiting for the moment, for his kind of Guggenheim moment. I was totally blown over by Moholy Nagy's Guggenheim moment and the diversity of the works that have been done. And what is interesting is at the same time that they were here, network science was developing here in Hungary. And we should mention actually that the small world idea, the idea of 6 degrees of separation, was really born here in Budapest by Frigyes Karinti, a local writer. And the fact that really the first quantitative model of networks was by 2 Hungarian mathematicians, Paul Erdős and Alfred Rényi, from 1959. So there is actually a great symbiosis of thinking about these forms, both from the mathematical perspective as well as from the visual perspective, that has its roots in this kind of mid-Central European environment that Budapest represents.
And another quick question, is there something that you really struggle with, whether it's the bias of interpreting data, glitches, presentation? I mean, what's the narrow bottleneck for you? What is the real challenge in the work?
Well, it's the question is, what is your goal? And that defines your bottleneck, right? And what we haven't really talked about it is one of the reasons why this particular journey is very interesting for me, is because the goal of this exhibit is to take these visualizations out of the computer screen and bring it back to the physical space so that we can interact with them in a different way. And the reason why we need to interact with a different way is because it gives a different meaning. It gives a very different relationship to the data. And that's why it has been so important for me and the lab to kind of develop, for example, the data sculptures, where it really becomes a data sculpture that you can walk around and you can really understand the relationship between the nodes and links and so on. So I think that the biggest challenge and what we're struggling with is always, what is the right form of representation and material for a particular data set? And it's not that you can make everything into a visualization, you can turn everything into a data structure. No, the data speaks to us. The data has limitations. In the same way that, there are certain things you can do with on an oil painting, but you actually have a completely different limitations when you try to sculpt something in wood or in marble. The data imposes limitations, and the challenge for us is always find the form that really is kind of captures the innate nature of that data set.
Well, this actually sets up my last question, which I'd like to ask each of you, starting with Peter, and then you'll get the last word. It kind of goes to this question of limitations. We are living in a particular moment. It has its own limitations, right? All we have to do is think back to 20, 30 years ago and realize how the limitations then would have rendered all this impossible. So imagine, Peter and Laszlo, that we are going to have a reunion 20 years from now, and we will watch this video. We will watch this 20 years from now, rewatch this program. Art and science have both progressed a tremendous amount in those 20 years. What do you think would seem to be the most relevant and the most curious about this exhibition and this conversation that we're having today? Peter.
I remember that Alfred Renier, which was mentioned by Laszlo, wrote a book called Ars Mathematica. Or was it called Ars Arithmetica? I don't remember. Was it called? It was called Ars Mathematica or Ars Arithmetica, as mathematics and arithmetic as art. So it's the first step. Then we have this wonderful book by Donald Knuth, The Art of Programming. So this was the next important step. And now we have the wonderful book, The Art of Network Thinking. This is a third step in the evolution, what I call Renaissance 2.0. We are moving in this 21st century in a new convergence of science and art, and which is really an echo chamber of the Renaissance 500 years ago. Because today is the first time artists and scientists share a common tool of tools. Scientists use computer, artists use computer. Therefore, we have a new prototype, like the Renaissance. Artists can be scientists, scientists can be artists. So this will be the moment that we remember in the later decades, that we articulated the steps, Ars Mathematica, Ars of Programming, and Ars of Network Thinking. This is a very important step what Barabási and his lab are doing. My question is, Laszlo, your lab, is it a private institution funded by all kinds of supporters, or is it a state institution?
So the BarabásiLab is really embedded within Northeastern University, and it's a research lab within that. Okay. And you know, mostly kind of we'll have young people working there for 2 to 5 years. This is typically the time that people are spending there. And I'm kind of the dinosaur in that team.
So dinosaur. Imagine you're a 20-year-older dinosaur.
Yes.
How would you look back to this moment? What would seem relevant and curious?
So of course we're a very interesting moment right now, particularly with the COVID and these changes. But I think that first of all, this is a particular moment because we're kind of first time kind of showing our work in the art space, and it is such a challenge for us to really kind of find the right way to do that. But I think that probably what would be the most relevant 20 years from now, if I want to kind of project, is the difficulty we have gone through to acquire and to analyze and visualize these data. And what I'm hoping that with the emergence of AI and the kind of the new tool set, these type of ways of representing the world and penetrating and understanding the world will be at the fingerprint of any student, say 20 years from now. So they would look back as the gorillas to kind of like how slowly we were moving in that space and how limited was our kind of tool of expression, and particularly the speed that we could actually achieve new ideas.
But they will be very grateful for the work that these gorillas were doing. I just want to conclude by saying, I think this exhibition and hopefully this conversation gave everyone watching a taste for how we are really reaching a new moment, both in science and in art, a new moment when art begins to use data as its own subject, a moment that raises profound questions about who decides what is art, what is science, what are their connections, a moment that certainly opens up new opportunities for science, as your work has shown, but also opens up new opportunities for art, and also raises new questions about authorship and what are the tools we use to create this new kind of art for the 21st century. So with that, I'd like to thank once again our hosts here at TCOM, the Ludwig Museum, CKM, Professor Weibel over in Karlsruhe, and especially my friend Laszlo. And I invite everyone to see the show, read the book, look at it online, watch this again 20 years from now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, András. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you so much. Thank you, András. Thank you, Laszlo. Thank you so much. Thank you, really. Laszlo and András.
In a few months.
Exactly. Danke.